Emily Dawson was the kind of person who could blend into a crowd effortlessly. At first glance, she seemed ordinary average height, brown hair often tied in a neat bun, and a quiet smile that always appeared ready but never forced. She had a warmth about her that made people feel comfortable, though they rarely looked deeper. If you passed her in the grocery store or sat next to her on a bus, you might not even notice her. But that was just how Emily liked it. She was a schoolteacher, and a good one at that. Her days were spent guiding young minds, teaching them the importance of curiosity and kindness. She had a way of making even the shyest students feel seen. Parents praised her, colleagues admired her, and the children adored her. Emily's world revolved around fostering a safe, happy environment for her students, a place where they could grow without fear or judgment. It was a job she loved, though it wasn't always easy. Despite her gentle demeanor, Emily's life hadn't been without its challenges. She had faced hardships that could have broken anyone else, but she met them head-on, growing stronger each time. There were moments when life seemed unfair, when she wanted to scream at the sky, but she never let those feelings show. Emily had learned early on that strength didn't always mean being loud or aggressive. Sometimes, true strength was found in silence, in knowing when to act and when to hold back. This quiet resilience was her secret weapon, though few ever saw it. On this particular Thursday afternoon, Emily was wrapping up another busy day at the school. The final bell had rung, and the once bustling hallways were now eerily quiet. Most of the teachers had already left, and the students were long gone, except for a few lingering in after-school programs. Emily stayed behind to grade papers and prepare for the next day. She liked this time of day, the calm after the storm, when she could focus without interruptions. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the parking lot in hues of orange and pink, Emily gathered her things and made her way to her car. Her bag, overflowing with lesson plans and student assignments, hung heavily from her shoulder. She juggled her keys in one hand and a coffee thermos in the other, mentally running through her evening plans. Dinner, maybe a little grating, and then some quiet time with her husband, David. It was a routine she cherished. But as she stepped into the school parking lot, the sound of laughter shattered the tranquil evening. Emily paused, her brow furrowing slightly. The laughter was loud, boisterous, and laced with an edge that made her uneasy. She glanced toward the source of the noise and saw them, a group of bikers, their motorcycles lined up like an impromptu barricade. There were 5 of them, all dressed in leather jackets and jeans, their tattoos catching the fading sunlight. They weren't familiar faces, and they definitely didn't belong on school property. Emily's first instinct was to ignore them. She wasn't one to judge people by their appearances, but something about their presence felt out of place. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and headed toward her car, keeping her eyes forward. As she walked, the voices grew louder, their laughter echoing across the empty lot. She quickened her pace, hoping to avoid any interaction. "Hey, lady," one of them called out, his voice rough and teasing. "Where you off to in such a hurry?" Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she kept walking, pretending she hadn't heard. Her car was only a few steps away now. If she could just get in and drive off, this would all be over. But they weren't done with her. "Don't ignore us," another voice shouted, this one deeper, almost a growl. The sound of footsteps followed, heavy boots on asphalt. Emily clenched her keys tightly, her pulse quickening. She turned her head slightly and saw one of them approaching her, his hands stuffed casually in his jacket pockets, a smirk plastered across his face. The others watched from a distance, leaning against their bikes like spectators at a show. "Relax, lady," the man said, his tone mocking. "We're just saying hi." Emily stopped and turned to face him, her expression calm despite the tension building inside her. She'd dealt with unruly students, angry parents, and more than her fair share of rude strangers. This wasn't her first encounter with disrespectful behavior, though it was certainly one of the more intimidating ones. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. The man raised an eyebrow, seemingly amused by her composure. "Help us?" "Nah, we're good. Just thought you looked like someone who could use some company." The others laughed, their voices carrying across the lot. Emily resisted the urge to roll her eyes. She had dealt with this type before, people who thought they could intimidate or belittle her because she didn't fit their idea of strong. What they didn't know was that Emily's strength wasn't something you could see. It wasn't in her size or her voice, it was in her spirit, her unshakable resolve. "I appreciate the offer," she said, her tone polite but firm, "but I'm fine on my own." She turned back toward her car, hoping that would be the end of it. But, of course, it wasn't. "Hey, don't walk away when we're talking to you," the man called after her, his voice sharper now. Emily felt her jaw tighten. She didn't have time for this, and frankly, she was losing patience. "Look," she said, turning back to face him, "I don't want any trouble. I'm just trying to go home." The man took a step closer, his smirk returning. "Trouble? Who said anything about trouble? We're just being friendly." Behind him, one of the other bikers called out, "Yeah, we're all about making friends." More laughter followed. Emily glanced toward the school building, hoping anyone might still be inside. But the windows were dark, and the doors were locked. She was alone out here, with only her wits and a growing sense of unease to guide her. What these men didn't know was that Emily wasn't afraid. Annoyed? Yes. Frustrated? Definitely. But afraid? Not even close. Because Emily Dawson had faced far scarier things in her life than a group of men with overinflated egos. And while she didn't want to escalate the situation, she knew she wasn't powerless. As the man stepped closer, Emily's grip tightened around her keys. She didn't flinch, didn't step back. Instead, she held her ground, her gaze steady and unwavering. The man seemed to notice her confidence, his smirk faltering for just a moment. But before he could say another word, a new sound broke through the tension, the steady crunch of boots on asphalt. Emily didn't need to turn around to know who it was. A small smile played at the corners of her lips as the footsteps grew louder, each one more deliberate than the last. Her patience had been tested, but now, help had arrived. And these bikers were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. The crunch of boots on asphalt grew louder, slow and deliberate, each step cutting through the bikers' laughter like a warning. Emily didn't turn around immediately. She didn't need to. She knew that walk well, steady, calm, and confident. A walk that belonged to someone who had nothing to prove but everything to protect. "Is there a problem here?" The voice that spoke was calm, even friendly, but carried an unmistakable edge that demanded attention. The biker who had been taunting Emily froze mid-step, his smirk slipping. He turned his head toward the source of the voice, his confidence faltering as he sized up the newcomer. David Dawson stepped into view, his presence instantly commanding. At first glance, he didn't look like someone to be feared. Dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, with a canvas duffel bag slung over his shoulder, he could have been mistaken for any average guy. But there was something in his posture, the way he carried himself, that hinted at a deeper strength. The bikers seemed to notice it too. Their laughter had quieted, replaced by a tension that thickened the air. David stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes locking onto the man who had approached Emily. "I asked you a question," David said, his tone still calm but firmer now. "Is there a problem here?" The biker blinked, as though trying to regain his composure. He glanced back at his group, clearly looking for backup, but none of them moved. They were watching David closely, their earlier bravado replaced by unease. "No problem," the biker finally said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had before. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, his stance shifting. "Just having a conversation with the lady here." David's gaze flicked to Emily, who met his eyes with a small, reassuring nod. She wasn't scared, he could see that, but she was definitely annoyed. He knew her well enough to recognize the subtle tension in her posture, the way her shoulders were slightly squared. "Is that true?" David asked, addressing Emily now. She raised an eyebrow at the biker, her expression calm but pointed. "Not exactly," she replied. The biker let out a short laugh, though it sounded forced. "Hey, no need to make a big deal out of this," he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "We were just joking around." David tilted his head slightly, studying the man. He didn't move closer, but his presence alone seemed to shrink the space between them. "Joking around," David repeated, his tone neutral. "Doesn't sound like she found it very funny." The biker's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might push back. But something about David's steady gaze made him think twice. "Whatever, man," the biker muttered, taking a step back. He turned to his group, throwing up his hands. "Let's go. This place is boring anyway." The other bikers exchanged glances, clearly hesitant, but after a moment, they began moving toward their motorcycles. The leader shot David one last look, his eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge whether he was worth the trouble. Ultimately, he seemed to decide against it, because he climbed onto his bike without another word. The engines roared to life, shattering the silence of the parking lot. One by one, the bikers peeled out, leaving behind a trail of exhaust and attention that slowly began to dissipate. Emily let out a quiet breath as the last motorcycle disappeared down the street. She turned to David, her expression a mix of gratitude and amusement. "Perfect timing, as always," she said, adjusting the strap of her bag. David smiled, his eyes softening. "I could say the same for you. Looked like you were holding your own pretty well." "I had it under control," Emily replied with a shrug. "But I wasn't going to turn down some backup." David chuckled, reaching out to take the bag from her shoulder. "You shouldn't have to deal with that kind of nonsense in the first place," he said, his tone serious now. "What were they even doing here?" Emily shook her head. "No idea. They just showed up out of nowhere. I was hoping they'd leave on their own, but," she trailed off, gesturing toward the empty parking lot. "Well, you saw how that went." David frowned, his jaw tightening. "Idiots like that don't belong anywhere near a school." "They're gone now," Emily said gently, placing a hand on his arm. "That's what matters." He nodded, though the tension in his shoulders didn't fully ease. David was protective by nature, especially when it came to Emily. It wasn't about thinking she couldn't take care of herself, he knew better than anyone how strong she was. But knowing she'd been put in a situation where she felt even a flicker of discomfort made his blood boil. "Come on," he said, motioning toward her car. "Let's get you home." Emily smiled, falling into step beside him. As they walked, the earlier tension began to fade, replaced by the easy comfort of their shared rhythm. But as much as Emily tried to put the incident behind her, a small part of her couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't entirely over. David seemed to sense it too. As they reached her car, he hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting the bikers to reappear. "You think they'll come back?" Emily asked, her tone light but curious. David didn't answer right away. He opened the car door for her, setting her bag inside before leaning against the frame. "Hard to say," he admitted. "Guys like that, they don't like being embarrassed. Sometimes they let it go. Sometimes they don't." Emily considered this, her brow furrowing slightly. "If they do come back," she said, her voice calm but resolute, "I'll be ready." David's lips quirked into a small smile. "I don't doubt that for a second," he said. "But just in case, I think I'll stick around for a while." She tilted her head, studying him. "You don't have to do that." I'm sure they're long gone by now. Maybe, David said, straightening up. But it won't hurt to be sure. Emily nodded, appreciating his caution even as she hoped it wouldn't be necessary. She trusted David's instincts, they had never steered her wrong before. As she slid into the driver's seat, David closed the door behind her, leaning down to meet her gaze through the window. "Call me when you get home," he said. "I always do," she replied with a smile. He stepped back, watching as she started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. As her car disappeared down the street, David remained where he was, his gaze scanning the now empty lot. He couldn't shake the feeling that the bikers weren't done with whatever they had planned. And if they weren't, they'd be in for a surprise. It started with the roar of engines, deep and throaty, the kind of sound that seemed to echo across the quiet schoolyard. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the lot as a group of bikers rolled in, their motorcycles gleaming under the fading light. Emily Dawson paused mid-step, her arms full of lesson plans, and turned to see what was causing the noise. There were 5 of them, each dressed in worn leather jackets adorned with patches and insignias. They looked out of place among the neatly parked cars and the tidy lines of the school building. As their bikes came to a stop, their laughter broke through the silence, loud and raucous. Emily sighed quietly. She'd had a long day of teaching, a full schedule of classes, a stack of homework to grade, and a lingering headache that refused to fade. The last thing she needed was trouble. Still, she didn't let her discomfort show. Years of working with children had taught her the importance of keeping calm in the face of chaos. The leader of the group was the first to dismount, a burly man with a shaved head and tattoos that crawled up both arms like ivy. He walked with an air of authority, the kind of swagger that demanded attention. His friends followed close behind, their eyes scanning the parking lot as if they owned it. Emily resumed her walk, keeping her focus on her car. The keys jingled in her pocket as she quickened her pace. Maybe, she thought, they would ignore her. Maybe they were just passing through. But then he stepped in front of her. "Hey there, Teach," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. A smirk spread across his face as he blocked her path. Emily stopped, her grip tightening on the stack of papers in her arms. She raised her eyes to meet his, her expression calm and steady. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. The man chuckled, glancing back at his friends, who had spread out behind him like a wall. "What's the rush?" he said, ignoring her question. "A pretty lady like you shouldn't be in such a hurry." Emily's polite smile didn't waver, but she took a step to the side, trying to move around him. He shifted with her, blocking her path again. "Come on, stay a while," he said, his smirk widening. "We don't bite." The laughter behind him grew louder, echoing off the empty school walls. Emily's heart beat a little faster, but not from fear. She was calculating, assessing the situation with the same level-headedness she used in a classroom full of rowdy students. "I really need to get going," she said, her voice steady. "Excuse me." The man tilted his head, pretending to consider her words. "That's no way to talk to someone who's just trying to be friendly," he said. The others began to close in, their movements slow and deliberate, as if testing her reaction. They weren't touching her, but their presence was enough to make her feel boxed in. Emily glanced around the parking lot. It was mostly empty now. Most of the teachers and students had left for the day. A few cars were scattered here and there, but no one was nearby. She took a breath, steadying herself. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said, her voice calm but firmer now. The man laughed, a low, guttural sound. "Trouble? Who said anything about trouble?" he asked. His tone was playful, but the edge in his voice was unmistakable. The others joined in, their laughter blending into a cacophony that filled the air. One of them, a lanky man with a scar across his cheek, leaned against a nearby car, his arms crossed as he watched the scene unfold. Maybe she's shy, he said, grinning. Don't be shy, teach. We're all friends here. Emily's patience, already worn thin from the day, was beginning to fray. But she didn't let it show. Instead, she squared her shoulders and looked the leader straight in the eye. I said, excuse me, she repeated, her tone unyielding. For a moment, there was silence. The man's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as he realized she wasn't intimidated. His friends exchanged glances, the laughter fading into an uneasy quiet. The leader leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, almost menacing tone. You've got a lot of nerve, lady, he said. Emily didn't flinch. Her calmness wasn't rooted in fear, it was rooted in something far deeper. Years of experience had taught her how to handle difficult situations. But more than that, she knew she wasn't alone. As the leader took a step closer, Emily's gaze flicked past him, toward the edge of the parking lot. The sound of another engine reached her ears, not the deep, rumbling growl of the bikers' motorcycles, but a smoother, quieter hum. It was a sound she recognized instantly. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, though her expression remained unchanged. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The leader, oblivious to the subtle shift in her demeanor, continued his taunts. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue, he said, leaning closer. The others snickered, their confidence returning as they fed off his bravado. One of them, a stocky man with a thick beard, took a step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. But before he could say a word, the roar of the engine grew louder. The bikers turned, their heads swiveling toward the source of the noise. A sleek black car pulled into the lot, its polished exterior gleaming under the sun. It came to a smooth stop a few feet away, the driver's side door swinging open with a quiet click. David Dawson stepped out, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene before him. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The bikers stared at him, their earlier bravado faltering as they sized him up. David didn't look particularly intimidating at first glance. He was dressed in simple clothes, jeans, a plain t-shirt, and a lightweight jacket. But there was something about the way he carried himself that commanded attention. His gaze swept over the group, landing on Emily. You okay? He asked, his tone calm but laced with concern. Emily nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. I'm fine, she said. David's eyes shifted to the leader of the bikers, his expression hardening. Is there a reason you're bothering my wife? He asked, his voice low but firm. The leader hesitated, caught off guard by the question. We weren't bothering her, he said quickly, his tone defensive. Just having a little fun, that's all. David took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. Fun, huh? He said, his voice carrying an edge that made the bikers exchange uneasy glances. The leader opened his mouth to reply, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. David's presence was calm, almost unnervingly so, but it carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Emily watched the scene unfold, her confidence unwavering. She knew what was coming next, and for the first time that afternoon, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The bikers had no idea who they were dealing with. The leader of the bikers cleared his throat, his bravado faltering under David's calm but piercing gaze. His hands fidgeted at his sides, fingers twitching as if itching for a comeback but unsure what to say. Look, man, the leader said finally, trying to inject some confidence into his voice, we were just joking around. Didn't mean anything by it. David didn't blink. He stepped closer, closing the gap between himself and the group. The leader instinctively took half a step back, glancing over his shoulder at his crew, as if silently asking for backup. Here's the thing, David said, his voice low and measured. I don't find this kind of joke funny. And I'm sure my wife doesn't either. Emily stood to the side, watching with quiet composure. Her papers were still clutched in her arms, but she made no move to intervene. She knew David didn't need help. This was his arena now, and she trusted him to handle it. The stocky biker with the beard stepped forward, crossing his arms over his chest. He was clearly the second in command, and he didn't seem as easily rattled as the leader. "Who do you think you are, walking in here like that?" the stocky man asked, his tone more aggressive. "We weren't doing anything wrong." David turned his head slightly, giving the man a calm but pointed look. "I'm the guy telling you to back off," he said simply. The stocky man snorted, looking around at his friends for support. A couple of them chuckled nervously, though it was clear the tension was rising. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," the man said, stepping closer. He was taller than David, with broad shoulders and a menacing glare. "But guts don't mean much if you can't back them up." David tilted his head, studying the man as if deciding whether he was worth his time. Then he smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Is that so?" David asked, his voice even. Emily couldn't help but suppress a smile. She recognized that look. It was the same expression he wore during his matches, right before he dismantled an opponent. The leader of the group, sensing the growing tension, tried to regain control of the situation. Hey, he said, raising his hands. "Let's all calm down, yeah. No need to get worked up over nothing." David didn't look at him. His attention remained fixed on the stocky man, who was still trying to look intimidating. "Worked up?" David repeated, his tone sharp. "You think this is me worked up?" The stocky man opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, David took a deliberate step forward. The movement was subtle, almost casual, but it made the man flinch. "Here's what's going to happen," David said, his voice quiet but commanding. "You're going to apologize to my wife. And then you're going to leave." The leader let out a nervous laugh, trying to defuse the situation. "Apologize? Come on, man, you're blowing this out of proportion. We were just having a little fun." "Apologize," David repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. The stocky man scowled, his pride clearly wounded. "And if we don't?" he challenged. David's smile widened, though it was anything but friendly. "I wouldn't test me if I were you." Emily watched as the bikers shifted uneasily, their confidence unraveling under the weight of David's presence. She knew better than anyone what he was capable of, and she could see that they were beginning to sense it too. The lanky biker with the scar finally spoke up, his voice tinged with nervousness. "Come on, guys, maybe we should just go. No harm, no foul, right?" But the stocky man wasn't ready to back down. He squared his shoulders, his jaw tightening as he stared David down. "Or what?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. The parking lot seemed to grow quieter, the tension so thick it was almost palpable. David took a step closer, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "Or I'll make you wish you had," he said simply. For a moment, the stocky man hesitated, as if weighing his options. He glanced at the leader, who was frowning but said nothing. The silence stretched, the group caught in a standoff they clearly hadn't anticipated. Then, with a resigned huff, the leader stepped forward, raising his hands. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "We'll go. No need to make a big deal out of this." He turned to Emily, his smirk replaced by a forced smile. "Sorry about that, Teach. Didn't mean to upset you." Emily didn't respond. She simply met his gaze, her expression calm and unreadable. The leader gestured to his crew. "Let's roll." The others hesitated, their pride clearly bruised, but they eventually followed his lead. The stocky man muttered something under his breath, but a sharp look from David silenced him. As the bikers mounted their motorcycles and started their engines, The leader glanced back at David. "You got lucky today," he said, his tone bitter. David didn't reply. He simply stood there, watching as the group roared out of the parking lot, their bravado fading with the sound of their engines. When the lot was quiet again, David turned to Emily. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. Emily nodded, a small smile breaking through her composed exterior. "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you." David walked over to her, taking the stack of papers from her arms. "Long day?" he asked, his tone lightening. She chuckled. "You could say that." He glanced in the direction the bikers had gone, his expression thoughtful. "They won't bother you again," he said confidently. Emily reached out, touching his arm gently. "I know," she said. David smiled at her, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Let's get you home," he said, leading her toward the car. As they walked, Emily couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Not just for David's presence, but for the strength they shared, a quiet resilience that didn't need to shout to be heard. The bikers might have left with their pride bruised, but Emily knew the real victory lay in what they'd learned. Appearances can be deceiving, and underestimating someone might just be the biggest mistake of all. Emily's gaze remained steady as the leader of the bikers leaned in, the smug expression on his face daring her to challenge him further. His companions hung back, their chuckles subsiding into nervous shuffles as the tension thickened. Emily's voice was firm but calm. "Last chance," she said, each word deliberate. "Step aside." The leader grinned wider, clearly enjoying the confrontation. "You've got guts, Teach," he sneered. "But guts only get you so far." Before Emily could respond, the sound of deliberate, measured footsteps echoed across the parking lot. The quiet crunch of boots against the pavement sliced through the oppressive tension, drawing the attention of everyone present. The bikers turned, their smirks fading as a shadowy figure came into view. David walked toward them, his hands casually in his pockets, his expression calm but unreadable. Though his attire was simple jeans, a plain shirt, and a jacket, there was an undeniable presence about him, a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the space around him. "Is there a problem here?" David asked, his tone even but firm, his sharp eyes scanning the group of bikers before settling on their leader. The laughter and bravado from earlier seemed to drain from the air. The leader glanced back at his crew as if seeking their backing, but no one stepped forward. "And who are you supposed to be?" the leader asked, his voice carrying a forced bravado. He straightened his shoulders, trying to reassert control of the situation. David tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm the husband," he said simply. The leader's smirk faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered, barking a laugh. "The husband, huh? Well, your wife here has quite the attitude. Maybe you should teach her some manners." David took another step closer, his calm expression unchanged. "Maybe you should start by apologizing," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that left no room for argument. The leader stiffened, his jaw tightening. "Apologize," he repeated, his voice rising. "For what? We were just messing around." David didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a long, slow look at each member of the group. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, as the bikers shifted uneasily under his scrutiny. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter but somehow even more commanding. "It didn't look like just messing around from where I'm standing," he said. "Now, I'll say it again. Apologize. And then leave." The leader opened his mouth to retort but hesitated. Something in David's gaze made him falter. It wasn't anger or bluster, it was the kind of quiet intensity that only comes from someone who knows exactly what they're capable of. Behind him, the stocky biker shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should just go," he muttered under his breath. But the leader wasn't ready to back down. "And what if we don't?" he challenged, stepping closer to David. David didn't move. He didn't flinch or raise his voice. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on the leaders, his posture calm but unyielding. Emily watched the exchange, her heart steady. She knew David's strength wasn't just physical, it was in his composure, his ability to control a situation without needing to shout or threaten. The leader, on the other hand, was beginning to unravel. His bravado seemed less convincing with every passing second. David finally broke the silence, his tone carrying a faint edge. "You're making a mistake," he said. The leader's bravado cracked further. He glanced back at his crew, who were no longer laughing or smirking. Their unease was palpable, their confidence shaken by the sheer weight of David's presence. "What's the deal with you, anyway?" the lanky biker with the scar asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "You a cop or something?" David shook his head, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "No," he said simply. "Then what are you?" the stocky biker pressed, his tone more cautious than aggressive. David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another step closer to the leader, closing the distance between them. The leader instinctively leaned back, his tough guy act crumbling under the weight of David's steady gaze. "You don't want to know," David said quietly. The words hung in the air, carrying an unspoken warning that sent a ripple of unease through the group. Emily watched as the bikers exchanged nervous glances, their confidence unraveling with each passing second. She could see the gears turning in their heads, the realization slowly dawning on them that they had underestimated not just her but the man standing before them. The stocky biker took another step back, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Let's just go," he said again, his voice almost pleading. The leader hesitated, his pride clearly battling with his instincts. But before he could make a decision, David took another step forward, his calm demeanor giving way to a faint but unmistakable edge. "This is your last warning," David said, his voice low but firm. "Walk away. Now." The leader's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. For a moment, it looked like he might push back, might try to reclaim the control he had so clearly lost. But then he glanced into David's eyes, and whatever fight he had left seemed to evaporate. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. He turned to Emily, his tone grudging. "Sorry." David's gaze didn't waver. "Louder," he said. The leader gritted his teeth, his face flushing with humiliation. "I said I'm sorry," he repeated, louder this time. David nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Good," he said. The leader turned back to his crew, jerking his head toward their bikes. "Let's go," he barked. The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They mounted their motorcycles, their engines roaring to life as they prepared to leave. As they began to pull away, the leader shot David one last look, his expression a mixture of anger and lingering fear. "You got lucky," he muttered under his breath. David didn't respond. He simply watched as the group disappeared into the distance, their bravado thoroughly dismantled. When the parking lot was quiet again, David turned to Emily, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Emily nodded, a small smile breaking through her composed exterior. "I'm fine," she said. "Thanks to you." David returned her smile, his tension easing. "Let's get you home," he said, placing a protective hand on her back as they walked toward her car. As they drove away, Emily couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. The bikers had come looking for trouble, their arrogance blinding them to the reality of the situation. But in the end, they had learned an important lesson: appearances can be deceiving, and underestimating someone might just be the biggest mistake of all. And as for David, his quiet strength had once again proven that true power doesn't need to shout, it simply stands firm, unshaken by the storm. As David and Emily walked toward her car, the echoes of the bikers' engines faded into the distance, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost surreal. Emily glanced sideways at David, her husband's composed expression betraying none of the tension from moments before. "You really didn't have to do that," Emily said softly, though there was gratitude in her voice. David gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Of course, I did," he replied. "No one messes with my wife." Despite the lightness of his words, there was an undercurrent of seriousness in his tone, a reminder of the lengths he would go to protect her. Emily smiled back, but something in her chest tightened. She had always admired his calm strength, but she also knew the weight it carried. As they reached the car, Emily unlocked it and began placing her lesson plans in the back seat. She could feel David's eyes scanning their surroundings, his protective instincts still on high alert. "You really think they'll leave it at that?" Emily asked, glancing up at him. David's jaw tightened slightly, a flicker of thought crossing his face before he answered. "Probably," he said. "But if they don't, I'll handle it." His words were simple, but they carried a confidence that left no room for doubt. Emily shook her head, a small laugh escaping her lips despite the tension that still hung in the air. "You make it sound so easy," she said. David shrugged, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "It usually is," he said, his tone teasing but calm. Still, a nagging feeling lingered in Emily's mind. She had seen enough of human behavior to know that pride was a dangerous thing, and the leader of the bikers had plenty of it. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. As they drove home, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the memory of the confrontation lingered like a shadow in the back of Emily's mind. The next day at school, Emily was back to her usual routine. The halls were filled with the chatter of students, the hum of conversations providing a welcome distraction from the events of the previous afternoon. By the time lunch rolled around, she had almost managed to push the incident out of her mind. Almost. It wasn't until she was heading back to her classroom after a brief meeting that she noticed something out of place. A group of students had gathered near the window at the end of the hall, their whispers growing louder as they pointed toward the parking lot. Curiosity piqued, Emily walked over. As she approached, one of the students turned to her, his face pale. "Mrs. Dawson," he said hesitantly, "I think you should see this." Emily frowned, her pulse quickening as she stepped closer to the window. What she saw made her stomach drop. The same group of bikers from the day before was back, their motorcycles lined up in the school parking lot like a makeshift barricade. The leader stood at the center, his arms crossed and his expression grim. Emily's first thought was of the students. The bikers' presence was intimidating enough for her. She could only imagine how the kids felt. "Stay inside," she said firmly, turning to the group of students. "Tell your teachers to lock the doors. I'll handle this." "But Mrs. Dawson," one of the students began, his voice tinged with worry. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice steady. "Just do as I say." The students hesitated for a moment before nodding and hurrying down the hall. Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself before making her way outside. The midday sun was bright, but the tension in the air felt heavy. Emily approached the group with measured steps, her heart pounding in her chest. The leader noticed her first. He turned toward her, a smirk spreading across his face. "Well, look who it is," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Didn't think we'd see you again so soon." Emily stopped a few feet away, keeping her expression calm. "This is a school," she said firmly. "You need to leave." The leader chuckled, his amusement evident. "You've got guts, Teach," he said. "I'll give you that." He took a step closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "But yesterday didn't sit right with me," he continued. "Your husband made me look bad in front of my crew. And I don't like looking bad." Emily didn't flinch. "You made yourself look bad," she said evenly. Her words seemed to strike a nerve. The leader's smirk faltered, his expression darkening. "You've got a smart mouth for someone in your position," he said, his voice low. Emily didn't respond. She knew better than to escalate the situation unnecessarily. The leader stepped closer, his voice taking on a menacing edge. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to call your husband, and you're going to tell him to come down here. I've got a score to settle." Emily's heart sank. She had hoped the bikers would let things go, but it was clear now that their pride wouldn't allow it. "David doesn't need to get involved," she said, keeping her tone calm but firm. "This is between you and me." The leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the parking lot. "Oh, it's between me and him, all right," he said. Emily's mind raced as she considered her options. She could see the other teachers watching nervously from the windows, their faces filled with concern. She couldn't let this escalate further, not here, not now. And then, just as the tension seemed ready to boil over, a familiar sound reached her ears. The steady crunch of boots against pavement. David was here. The sight of her husband walking toward them filled Emily with a mixture of relief and apprehension. David's expression was calm as always, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that hadn't been there the day before. The bikers turned to face him, their earlier bravado quickly returning. Well, the leader said, his tone mocking. "If it isn't the hero himself." David didn't respond immediately. He stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed but poised. "I thought I made myself clear yesterday," David said, his voice steady. "Leave my wife alone. Leave this school alone." The leader chuckled, shaking his head. "You think you can just walk in here and tell us what to do," he said. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts only get you so far." David tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving the leader's. "And arrogance only gets you hurt," he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The leader bristled, his hands balling into fists. "You think you're tough, huh?" he said, stepping closer. "You think you can take me?" David didn't move. He didn't flinch or raise his voice. He simply stood there, his calm demeanor speaking louder than any threat ever could. "Try me," David said quietly. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence wavering once again. Emily watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding. She had seen David's strength before, but she also knew his restraint. He wouldn't act unless he had to, but if he did, there would be no going back. The leader hesitated, his bravado faltering under the weight of David's unyielding gaze. "You're not worth it," the leader muttered finally, turning away. The rest of the bikers followed suit, their earlier confidence shattered. As they mounted their motorcycles and roared out of the parking lot, Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. David turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Emily nodded, a small smile breaking through her tension. "I am now," she said. David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Let's get back inside," he said. As they walked back toward the school, Emily couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for David's strength, for his calm, and for the quiet resolve that made him the man she had fallen in love with. But even as the tension faded, one thing was clear, the bikers had underestimated them both. And that was a mistake they wouldn't make again. The leader's laugh was sharp and mocking, echoing through the now silent parking lot. "A boxer, huh? Big deal. What's that supposed to mean to me?" he sneered, his bravado masking a flicker of uncertainty. David didn't move. His calmness was unnerving, a contrast to the loud arrogance of the man before him. His eyes met the leader's, steady and piercing, as though he could see straight through him. "You should care," David said evenly. "Because if you keep pushing, you're going to find out exactly what that means." The leader's smirk wavered, just for a moment, but he quickly recovered, stepping closer to David. He was trying to assert dominance, to show his crew that he was still in control. "Listen, tough guy," the leader said, his voice low and threatening, "you think a few matches in the ring make you something special? Out here, none of that matters." David tilted his head slightly, his hands still casually resting at his sides. "You're right," he said. "Out here, what matters is knowing when to walk away. And you don't seem to know how to do that." The leader's jaw tightened, his pride refusing to let him back down. He clenched his fists, the veins on his arms bulging as he stepped even closer, his face now inches from David's. "What are you gonna do, huh?" he taunted. "Knock me out in front of my guys? Go ahead, champ. Show me what you've got." For a moment, the parking lot was silent except for the faint hum of idling motorcycles. Emily watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew David well enough to recognize the signs: the slight narrowing of his eyes, the calm, measured breaths. He was assessing the situation, calculating his next move. Then, breaking the tension, one of the younger bikers, barely more than a teenager, spoke up. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, but it carried enough weight to cut through the noise. "Wait," he said, his eyes widening as he stared at David. "David Dawson? The undefeated middleweight champion." The murmurs started immediately, spreading through the group like wildfire. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado fading as recognition dawned. "No way," another muttered. "That's him. I've seen his fights, he's a beast." The leader's confidence faltered, his posture stiffening as he glanced back at his crew. He could see the doubt in their eyes, the way they were slowly backing away, their loyalty wavering. Emily couldn't help but feel a surge of pride as she watched the realization ripple through the group. David hadn't needed to raise his voice or throw a punch; his presence alone was enough to shift the balance of power. The leader, now visibly flustered, turned back to David, his earlier bravado replaced by a forced smirk. "So what if you're some big shot boxer?" he said, his voice lacking the conviction it had moments ago. "That doesn't scare me." David took a single step forward, closing the distance between them. His movements were deliberate, his gaze steady as he looked the leader straight in the eye. "It should," he said quietly, his tone carrying a weight that made the leader flinch. "Because I'm not the guy you want to test. Walk away while you still can." The leader opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His crew was already retreating, their earlier bravado replaced by unease. The younger biker who had recognized David was the first to turn toward his bike, muttering something about not wanting any trouble. One by one, the others followed suit, their engines roaring to life as they prepared to leave. The leader stood frozen for a moment, his fists clenching and unclenching as he weighed his options. Emily stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "It's over," she said. "Take your crew and go. Don't come back." The leader hesitated, his pride battling against the reality of the situation. Finally, with a low growl of frustration, he turned away, muttering curses under his breath as he stomped toward his motorcycle. "You got lucky this time," he spat, throwing one last glare at David before mounting his bike. David didn't respond. He simply stood there, his calm demeanor unshaken, as the leader and his crew roared out of the parking lot, their presence fading into the distance. As the sound of the motorcycles disappeared, the tension in the air began to dissipate. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since the confrontation had begun. David turned to her, his expression softening as he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked gently. Emily nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I am now," she said. She looked up at him, her admiration for her husband growing with each passing moment. He had handled the situation with grace and strength, never once losing his composure. You really are something, you know that, she said, her voice filled with both gratitude and pride. David chuckled, a warm, genuine sound that broke through the lingering tension. I'm just glad they listened, he said. Emily shook her head, a playful smile on her face. Listened? They practically ran for their lives. David shrugged, his expression modest. Sometimes, it's not about what you say, it's about how you say it. Emily laughed, the sound light and genuine. Despite the events of the afternoon, she felt a sense of relief and safety she hadn't experienced in a long time. As they walked back toward her car, the distant sound of children laughing and playing filled the air, a reminder of the normalcy that had momentarily been disrupted. Emily glanced at David, her heart swelling with gratitude for the man who had stood by her side through it all. But more than that, she felt a renewed sense of strength within herself. She had faced the bikers head-on, refusing to back down or show fear. And while David's presence had ultimately tipped the scales, she knew that her own resolve had played a role as well. Thank you, she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. David smiled, his eyes warm as he looked at her. Always, he said simply. And with that, they climbed into the car, ready to leave the events of the day behind them. But one thing was certain: Emily Dawson and her husband were not people to be underestimated. David and Emily lingered in the parking lot for a moment, the silence around them a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded moments earlier. Emily glanced back at the spot where the bikers had been, her thoughts swirling. Do you think they'll come back? She asked, her voice quiet but steady. David shook his head. No, he said confidently. Guys like that are all bark when they're in a group. Once they're faced with someone who stands their ground, they usually scatter. Emily sighed, her shoulders still tense. It's just frustrating. I didn't want any trouble. I just wanted to get to my car and go home. David's hand found hers, his touch warm and grounding. You handled yourself well, he said. Better than most people would. You didn't back down. Emily smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the horizon. I guess I had to. Someone had to show them they couldn't just intimidate people for fun. David's lips curled into a proud smile. That's the Emily I know, he said. As they walked back toward her car, Emily couldn't help but think back to the early days of their relationship. David hadn't always been the calm, collected man he was now. In his younger years, his temper had been quick, his fists even quicker. He had shared stories with her, stories of his matches, of how he'd risen through the ranks of the boxing world. But he had also told her about the moments that had humbled him, the lessons he had learned about restraint, respect, and knowing when to fight and when to walk away. One memory in particular stood out, the time he had lost his first match. It wasn't a loss in the ring, he'd explained, but a loss of control. His emotions had gotten the better of him, and it had cost him dearly. That moment had shaped him, teaching him the importance of discipline not just in boxing, but in life. Emily had always admired that about him. He wasn't just strong physically, he was strong mentally and emotionally. And today, as she watched him confront the bikers with such poise, she was reminded of why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. As they reached her car, a familiar voice called out to them. Mrs. Dawson. Is everything okay? Emily turned to see Mr. Abernathy, the school principal, hurrying toward them. His brow was furrowed with concern, his tie slightly askew as if he had rushed out of his office. Everything's fine now, Mr. Abernathy, Emily said, her tone calm but firm. The principal glanced nervously at David, clearly unsettled by his imposing presence. I heard some commotion, he said. Bikers, was it? Do we need to call the authorities? Emily exchanged a look with David before shaking her head. It's been handled, she said simply. Mr. Abernathy's eyes darted between them, his curiosity evident. Handled? How exactly? David interrupted, his tone polite but authoritative. Let's just say they won't be coming back anytime soon. The principal nodded slowly, sensing that it was best not to press further. Well, I'm glad to hear that, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. If there's anything the school can do. There is, Emily said, cutting him off. Her voice was firm, her gaze steady. We need better security in the parking lot. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and it's only a matter of time before someone gets seriously hurt. Mr. Abernathy looked taken aback, clearly unprepared for Emily's directness. I'll certainly bring it up with the board, he stammered. Good, Emily said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Because next time, we might not be so lucky. As they drove home, the weight of the day's events began to sink in. Emily stared out the window, her thoughts a mix of frustration, relief, and pride. David glanced at her, his hand resting on the steering wheel. Penny for your thoughts, he asked. Emily sighed, her fingers tracing patterns on the edge of her seat. I guess I'm just tired of people thinking they can get away with things like this, she said. It's like they see me as an easy target because I'm quiet or because I don't fight back right away. David nodded, his expression thoughtful. People often mistake kindness for weakness, he said. But you showed them today that you're anything but weak. Emily smiled faintly, her gaze still fixed on the passing scenery. I guess I did, she said. But it's exhausting, you know? Having to prove yourself over and over again. David reached over, his hand finding hers once more. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, he said. You're strong because of who you are, not because of what you do to show it. Emily turned to him, her heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you, she said softly. The next morning, Emily arrived at school to find that word of the parking lot incident had spread. Colleagues approached her with hushed tones and wide eyes, their questions a mix of concern and curiosity. I heard what happened yesterday, one teacher said. Are you okay? Is it true that your husband is a professional boxer? Another asked. Emily answered their questions politely but briefly, her focus on preparing for the day ahead. She didn't want to dwell on the incident, it was in the past now, and she was ready to move forward. But as the day went on, she couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the way people treated her. There was a newfound respect in their eyes, a recognition that she was not someone to be underestimated. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt truly seen, not just as a teacher, but as a person. That evening, as she and David sat on the porch of their home, Emily found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. The confrontation with the bikers had been terrifying, but it had also been empowering. She realized that she wasn't just a quiet schoolteacher. She was a woman who could stand her ground, a woman who had the strength to face challenges head-on. And with David by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. You know, she said, her voice thoughtful, I think I learned something yesterday. David raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing on his lips. Oh? What's that? Emily smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Sometimes, the quietest people have the loudest strength. And it's not about shouting to be heard, it's about knowing when to speak and when to stand tall. David chuckled, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. I couldn't have said it better myself, he said. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over their home, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The world might not always be fair, but she had learned that she had the strength to face it one day, one challenge at a time. As the dust settled and the roar of the bikers' engines faded into the distance, Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The tension that had gripped the school parking lot only moments ago was now replaced by a strange calm. She turned to David, her lips curling into a small smile, equal parts amused and grateful. You didn't have to scare them that much, she said, teasing him as she handed over her stack of lesson plans and papers. David chuckled, the corner of his mouth lifting in that familiar, confident smirk. "They scared you first," he replied simply. "Besides, some people only learn the hard way." Emily shook her head, unable to suppress a laugh. David had a way of turning even the most nerve-wracking moments into something manageable. Before they could leave, Mr. Abernathy, the school's perpetually anxious principal, emerged from the building. His footsteps were hesitant as he approached, his face a mix of nervousness and awe. He had clearly witnessed the showdown, though he had stayed safely out of sight until now. "Mrs. Dawson." "Mr. Dawson," he began, his voice shaky. "That was, quite something." David glanced at Emily, then back at the principal, his expression neutral. "Everything's fine now," he said, his tone polite but firm. Yes, of course," Mr. Abernathy stammered, adjusting his tie nervously. "I had no idea that you could handle yourself in that way." His eyes darted to David. "And you, sir? I mean, a professional boxer? Why didn't you say anything before?" Emily laughed softly. "Well, Mr. Abernathy, I didn't think my husband's career was relevant to teaching multiplication tables," she said, her tone light but pointed. The principal nodded quickly, clearly still processing everything he had seen. Of course. "Well, I'll have to write a formal report about this, but I'll make sure to include your quick thinking and bravery, Mrs. Dawson. And, Mr. Dawson, your assistance." David gave a small nod, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Just doing what needed to be done," he said. By the time Emily walked into the teacher's lounge the next day, the story of the parking lot confrontation had already spread like wildfire. Whispers followed her down the hallway, and colleagues who had never paid her much attention suddenly looked at her with a mix of curiosity and admiration. "Emily, is it true your husband is the David Dawson?" one teacher asked, her voice barely a whisper but filled with excitement. "Did he really take on a gang of bikers?" another chimed in, eyes wide. Emily sighed, setting down her coffee mug. "It wasn't as dramatic as it sounds," she said, though she couldn't help but smile. "David just helped them see reason." Her colleagues exchanged knowing looks, clearly impressed. For years, Emily had been the quiet, dependable teacher who rarely made waves. But now, she was something more, a figure of quiet strength and someone who, despite her unassuming demeanor, could handle herself in the face of adversity. The students, too, had picked up on the buzz. As Emily walked into her classroom, the usual chatter died down, replaced by an unusual silence. One of the braver students raised his hand. "Mrs. Dawson, is it true your husband could, knock someone out in one punch?" Emily paused, her eyes narrowing playfully. "What do you think?" she asked, redirecting the attention back to the lesson. But the questions didn't stop there. At lunch, a group of students approached her. "Mrs. Dawson, are you, a secret superhero or something?" one of them asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Emily laughed, shaking her head. "No superheroes here," she said. "Just someone who believes in standing up for what's right." The students exchanged glances, clearly impressed. From that day on, there was a noticeable shift in how they treated her. The usual minor disruptions in class diminished, replaced by a newfound respect. It was as if her quiet strength had finally been recognized, and the students like her colleagues were taking notice. As for the bikers, they were never seen near the school again. Rumor had it that their leader, still nursing his wounded pride, had warned his crew to steer clear of the area. "I don't care what you do," he reportedly told them, his voice low and serious. "But we're not messing with anyone at that school. Especially not her." It wasn't just fear of David that kept them away. It was something deeper, the realization that they had underestimated the wrong person. Emily's quiet defiance had left an impression on them, one that was hard to shake. Back at the school, Mr. Abernathy made good on his promise to improve security. Within weeks, the parking lot was outfitted with new cameras, and a part-time security guard was hired to patrol during school hours. "This is long overdue," Emily told him during a staff meeting. Mr. Abernathy nodded, his expression earnest. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Dawson," he said. "And I want to thank you for bringing this to our attention, even if it was under less than ideal circumstances." Emily smiled. "Better late than never," she said. That evening, as Emily and David sat on their porch, enjoying the quiet hum of crickets and the cool evening air, Emily couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. "Do you think it's over?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. David, sitting beside her with a glass of iced tea in hand, nodded. "It's over," he said simply. Emily leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of the day slip away. "You know," she said after a moment, "it's funny how life works. I never wanted to be in the spotlight, but now I feel like I've proven something. To myself, at least." David smiled, reaching over to take her hand. "You didn't have anything to prove," he said. "But you showed everyone what I've known all along. You're stronger than you think." Emily squeezed his hand, her heart full. "And I guess I'm lucky to have you in my corner," she said softly. David chuckled. "Always," he said. The events of that day became more than just a story to tell, it became a lesson for everyone involved. For Emily, it was a reminder of her own resilience and the power of standing up for what's right. For the students and staff at the school, it was a wake-up call about the importance of respect and the strength that can lie behind a quiet demeanor. And for the bikers, it was a humbling experience they wouldn't soon forget. In the end, justice was served not just through David's presence, but through Emily's unwavering determination to rise above the intimidation and take back her power. Sometimes, the loudest victories are won in silence, with quiet strength and steady resolve. And Emily Dawson was living proof of that. As Emily Dawson sat in her living room that evening, the house filled with a soft, peaceful silence, she reflected on everything that had happened. The events of the past few days had changed her in ways she hadn't expected. She had always prided herself on being a calm, kind teacher who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. She'd believed, like many people, that the world rewarded kindness and patience. But what had happened in that school parking lot had shown her something different. For so long, she had kept her strength hidden, wrapped up in the quiet corners of her life, assuming that her gentleness was enough to protect her. Yet in that moment, facing down a group of bikers who had underestimated her, she had discovered just how much power she truly possessed. It wasn't a power that came from anger or force, it was the strength that came from knowing who she was, what she stood for, and being willing to stand her ground when the time came. Looking at David, who was sitting beside her, his steady presence always a source of comfort, Emily smiled to herself. They had come a long way together. His role in the confrontation had been clear, a protector who would always stand beside her. But what had surprised her most was how her own courage had risen to meet the challenge, how she had found her voice and her resolve in a moment of unexpected confrontation. It was a quiet victory, not one of loud, boastful words, but one of silent strength, rising up when needed most. She thought of all the times in her life when she had been told to hold back or to play it safe. As a teacher, she had always been careful, always patient, always ready to forgive and understand. But in that moment, when those bikers had pushed her too far, she realized that kindness was not a weakness, and neither was patience. Sometimes, kindness needed to be guarded by strength. Sometimes, you had to stand tall, even if the world didn't expect it. And sometimes, standing tall meant making sure that those who tried to take advantage learned a hard lesson in respect. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It wasn't about showing the world how strong she could be. It was simply about knowing her own value and refusing to let others define her by their own narrow view of who she was. The truth, she realized, was that the world often undervalues kindness, assuming that the quiet ones are easy to walk over, that the soft-spoken people are just targets waiting to be picked on. But that couldn't be further from the truth. True strength doesn't need to boast. It doesn't need to announce itself with loud words or displays. True strength is quiet. It doesn't make noise, it makes an impact. Emily thought about the people in her life who had shaped her understanding of power. Her parents had always been good to others, treating everyone with respect, regardless of their station in life. They had taught her that kindness was a form of strength. Her students had taught her the same lesson in a different way through their curiosity, their honesty, and their occasional mischief. They reminded her that, even when the world was loud and overwhelming, a quiet moment of understanding could change everything. And then, of course, there was David. He was everything. Emily wasn't a boxer who made his living through strength and physicality. But even David knew that the power he held inside the ring was a tool, something he used only when necessary, never out of pride or anger. His calmness, his quiet confidence, had always been a source of inspiration for Emily. It wasn't about his career, it was about the way he carried himself in the world, with respect for others and an inner strength that radiated quietly, even when he wasn't trying to show it. Emily's thoughts drifted back to the bikers and the confrontation in the parking lot. The way they had underestimated her, the way they had assumed that because she was a teacher, because she was a woman, they could push her around. And how, in the end, it had been her quiet strength, backed by David's presence, that made them realize they'd made a mistake. The lesson was clear: don't judge people by appearances. Don't assume that kindness means weakness, or that being quiet means you don't have a backbone. She thought of her students again, the way they now looked at her, with a bit more respect, a little more awe in their eyes. They had witnessed her strength not through a loud speech or a dramatic confrontation, but in the way she held her ground, the way she didn't back down when faced with a challenge. She knew that lesson would stick with them far longer than any math equation or history fact she could teach. In a world that often valued loud voices and flashy displays of power, Emily had learned that sometimes the quietest people hold the loudest strength. The ones who don't need to shout to be heard, the ones who don't need to demand attention but who command it simply by being themselves. The ones who act when it's needed most, not out of ego or pride, but because it's the right thing to do. Her journey had taught her that power was not just in the physical or the obvious. It wasn't just about muscles or status or position. True power was in choosing to act, to stand firm, when the moment demanded it. It was in knowing that sometimes you have to rise, not for yourself but for the people around you, for the values you hold dear, and for the respect you deserve. Emily knew now that there was no need to boast about her strength. She didn't need to tell anyone about the bikers, about what had happened in the parking lot. She didn't need to parade her actions for others to see. What mattered was that she had acted, that she had stood her ground, and that she had done it with grace. And as she sat beside David, the quiet strength of the moment settling in her heart, she realized that this lesson wasn't just for her, it was for everyone. It was for anyone who had ever been underestimated, anyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, anyone who had ever been made to feel small. True power, she now understood, doesn't need to boast. It doesn't need to announce itself. It simply acts when the time is right, in the way that matters most. She leaned her head against David's shoulder, feeling at peace. The world was always full of challenges, full of moments where people would try to tear you down or push you around. But Emily had learned something invaluable. Sometimes, the loudest strength comes from the quietest person in the room. And the world would do well to remember that. So, in the end, Emily Dawson had found her power. And in doing so, she had shown everyone around her that true strength doesn't shout. It simply acts. And when the time comes to stand up for what's right, it's that quiet strength that speaks the loudest.